Sometimes, the most powerful moments in television happen when not even the hosts know what's about to happen. And a surprise changes everything. It was a typical Thursday in March at the Late Late Show studio in Los Angeles. The bright stage lights created that familiar atmosphere of nighttime entertainment, while the audience of 300 people eagerly awaited the start of another celebrity interview. Can you sense when there's something magical in the air, when cameras are about to capture something genuinely unexpected? James Corden adjusted his tie one last time while checking his notes for the interview with Shaquille O'Neal. It was a conversation planned to be casual, talking about new projects, post-basketball career, maybe some jokes about his height. Nothing more than the usual script for a talk show night. On the other side of the stage, Shaq walked with large steps that made the floor vibrate slightly. At 51 years old, he's still impressed with his physical presence. 7 feet and 4 inches of pure imposingness that transformed any environment into something smaller. But there was something different in his eyes that night. An almost imperceptible anxiety, as if he carried a secret that was about to explode. "Ladies and gentlemen," James announced with his characteristic British accent, "please welcome the one and only Shaquille O'Neal." The audience exploded in applause, while Shaq waved and smiled. But any attentive observer would notice that his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He sat in the guest chair, which seemed to shrink dramatically under his size, and greeted James with that natural cordiality that had made him beloved far beyond the sports world. "Shaq, always a pleasure," James began. "How are you doing tonight?" "I'm good, James. Actually, I'm better than good," Shaq responded, his deep voice echoing through the studio. "Tonight is going to be very special." James smiled, thinking it was just Shaq's usual charm. "Oh, is it? Are you going to sing for us again?" The audience laughed, remembering previous performances, but Shaq shook his head slowly. No. Tonight is about something much more important than entertainment. It's impossible not to feel when the energy of an entire environment is about to change dramatically." James noticed the change in tone and leaned slightly forward. "Okay, you've got my attention. What's going on?" Shaq took a deep breath, his enormous hands closing and opening nervously. "James, before we start this interview, I need to ask you something. I need your production team to bring someone very special to the stage." "Someone special?" James repeated, looking confused at the producers backstage. "Shaq, this wasn't in the script." "I know, and I'm sorry for the surprise. But there's someone in your audience tonight who doesn't know why she's here," Shaq explained, his voice gaining an emotional intensity that made the audience instinctively silent. "Her name is Mrs. Dorothy Williams. She's sitting in the 3rd row, wearing a blue dress." The cameras moved quickly to find the mentioned woman. There she was, a 67-year-old black woman, gray hair carefully arranged, wearing a modest blue dress and an expression of total confusion. She looked around as if she was certain there had been some misunderstanding. How many times in life are we surprised to discover that we are part of something much bigger than we imagined? "Mrs. Williams," James said gently, to the cameras that now focused on the lady, "would you mind joining us on stage?" Dorothy put a hand to her chest, clearly surprised. "Me? There must be some mistake. I'm just here to watch the show." "No mistake, ma'am," Shaq said, getting up from the chair and extending a hand in her direction. "Please, I really need you to come up here." The production quickly arranged for Dorothy to be escorted to the stage. Each step she took toward the center of attention revealed a mixture of nervousness and natural dignity. When she finally reached the stage, standing next to James's chair, She looked tiny compared to Shaq's imposing figure. "Mrs. Williams," James said gently, "I have to admit, I'm as confused as you are right now. But Shaq seems to have something very important to tell you." Dorothy looked at Shaq with curious but cautious eyes. "I'm sorry, young man, but I don't think we've met before." What happened next left everyone in the studio. Audience, production crew, James Corden, and viewers at home, completely speechless. Shaquille O'Neal, one of the most dominant athletes in history, a man who had intimidated opponents for decades, slowly knelt on the stage floor, getting to Dorothy's eye level. "Mrs. Williams," he said, his voice trembling with an emotion that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "My name is Shaquille O'Neal. But when I was 15 years old, you knew me as that awkward giant kid at Cole High School in San Antonio." Dorothy covered her mouth. With her hands, her eyes widening as the memory began to form. "This woman," Shaq said, turning to the audience with tears already forming in his eyes, "saved my life when I was 12 years old." He paused, letting the words echo through the silent studio. "And she doesn't even know it." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of held breaths and some muffled sobs from the audience. James Corden was speechless. Dorothy had tears streaming down her face. And Shaq remained, kneeling, looking at the woman who had changed the course of his entire life. And there, on that stage in Los Angeles, a 39-year story was about to be told for the first time. There are moments in adolescence when we feel so different that we believe we're defective. And sometimes just one person is enough to completely change that perspective. It was September 1987 in San Antonio, Texas, and the suffocating heat of the Texas summer still dominated the corridors of Robert G. Cole High School. Can you sense that there's something unique in the energy of a military school, where discipline and order mix with the natural chaos of adolescence? For most students, this was just another normal school year. For 15-year-old Shaquille O'Neal, it was another desperate attempt to fit into a world that seemed to have no space for him. At 15 years old, Shaq already measured 6 feet and 7 inches. His feet were size 52. His hands looked like baseball gloves, and he needed to duck to pass through the school doors. Every movement of his called unwanted attention. Every step echoed through the corridors like involuntary announcements of his presence. It's impossible not to feel how suffocating it can be to carry a body that constantly attracts stares. At home, the situation wasn't easier. Lucille O'Neal, his mother, worked double shifts as security at a local company and still did cleaning on weekends to supplement the income. His stepfather, Sergeant Philip Harrison, was frequently stationed at other military bases, leaving Shaq as the man of the house to take care of his younger siblings, Aisha, Latifah, and Jamal. What weighed most heavily on young Shaq's heart wasn't just his physical appearance, but the constant feeling of not belonging anywhere. The family had moved so many times because of Philip's military career that Shaq never had time to create deep roots. How many times in adolescence do we feel like we're foreigners in our own lives? At Cole High School, the comments were constant and cruel. Frankenstein, Bigfoot, Freak Show, nicknames that cut deeper than any criticism about his grades or athletic abilities. During recess, Shaq would hide in the library or bathrooms to avoid the laughter and pointing from his peers. "Mom," he had confessed to Lucille one night after she arrived exhausted from work, "I can't take it anymore. Everyone laughs at me. I look like a monster." Lucille O'Neal, a strong woman who had raised 4 children practically alone, sat on her son's bed and held his enormous hands between hers. "Shaquille, baby, you're not a monster. You're special. God has plans for you." But for a 15-year-old teenager who just wanted to disappear into the crowd, his mother's words, even full of love, sounded like empty consolations. The breaking point came on a Thursday in October. Shaq was in Mrs. Dorothy Williams's American literature class, trying to shrink into the desk that was too small for his size. The class was discussing Of Mice and Men, and when they got to the character, Lenny, the misunderstood gentle giant, some students started laughing and deliberately looking at Shaq. "Look, he's just like Shaq," whispered a boy from the front row. "Big, but kind of dumb." The laughter was like knives in Shaq's heart. He got up abruptly, making the desk creak, and left the room without asking permission. Mrs. Williams called his name, but he was already, running through the corridors, his steps echoing like thunder across the linoleum floor. That day, Shaq made a decision that would change everything. He wouldn't go back to school anymore. He couldn't stand being the spectacle, the joke, the monster that everyone pointed at. It was better to give up education and find a job, any job, where he could be useful without being judged. When he got home, he found a note from his mother. "Shaq, I'm at work until late. Take care of the little ones. Love you." He looked at Aisha, Latifah, and Jamal watching television in the small living room and felt the weight of responsibility he carried. If he gave up school, how would he help support the family? How would he be an example for his siblings? But the pain of being different, of being constantly ridiculed, seemed greater than any responsibility. That's when the doorbell rang. Shaq opened the door and found Mrs. Dorothy Williams standing on the threshold, holding a folder of schoolwork and a gentle smile that didn't hide the concern in her eyes. "Hi, Shaquille," she said softly. "May I come in? I need to talk to you and your mother." "My mother is at work," Shaq responded, avoiding her gaze. "Then I'll wait," Mrs. Williams said simply, and invited herself in. What's most impressive is how some people have the courage to appear exactly when we need them most, even when we don't know we need them. Mrs. Williams sat on the O'Neal family's small sofa and spent the next 2 hours talking with Shaq and his siblings. She didn't mention the classroom incident, didn't give sermons about the importance of education. Instead, she simply talked about books, about dreams, about how each person has something unique to offer the world. When Lucille arrived from work at 9 at night, she found Mrs. Williams still there, now helping Jamal with his math homework while Shaq prepared sandwiches for everyone. "Mrs. O'Neal," Dorothy said, standing respectfully, "your son is exceptional, not just because of his size, but because of his intelligence, his kindness with his siblings, and his natural leadership capacity." Lucille looked at her son, who was standing in the kitchen listening to every word. "The problem isn't Shaquille," Mrs. Williams continued. "The problem is that the world hasn't learned to see giants like him the right way yet." And it was at that moment, in the small living room of a military family in San Antonio, that a teacher decided to change the life of a boy who was about to give up on himself. "Shaquille," she said, looking directly into his eyes, "I'm going to make a promise to you and your mother. I'm going to help you see that your size isn't a curse. It's a gift." She paused, letting the words settle like seeds in fertile soil. "And I'm going to prove it to you. There are people who enter our lives and don't just change our perspective. They teach us to see who we really are when we look in the mirror." Back on the late, show stage, Shaq was still kneeling before Mrs. Dorothy, who was now crying silently as the memories of 35 years came back like gentle but powerful waves. Can you sense that there are moments when the past and present meet so perfectly that it seems like the universe conspired to create that instant? James Corden, who had remained in respectful silence, finally found his voice. "Shaq, I think everyone here needs to understand. How exactly did Mrs. Williams save your life?" Shaq slowly stood up and turned to the audience, his enormous hands discreetly wiping the tears that insisted on falling. "She kept her promise," he said, his voice echoing with gratitude that came from the depths of his soul. "Every single day, she kept her promise." He looked again at Mrs. Dorothy, who was now sitting in the guest chair, still processing the surreal reality of being there. "The next morning, after she came to my house," Shaq continued, "I went back to Cole High School. I was scared, embarrassed, ready to drop out again. But when I walked into her classroom, she had done something that changed everything." The audience leaned forward, as if physically trying to absorb every word. She had rearranged the entire classroom. All the desks were in a circle, and she had brought in a special chair. A big, strong chair that fit me perfectly. But that wasn't the amazing part. Shaq paused, the weight of the memory still capable of moving him after all these decades. The amazing part was what she wrote on the blackboard. In big letters, she had written, "Giants throughout history have been protectors, leaders, and champions. Today, we learn from our own giant." Mrs. Dorothy covered her face with her hands, clearly remembering that day with a clarity that only transformative moments possess. "She made me stand in front of the class," Shaq continued, "and instead of letting them make jokes, she asked me to talk about what it felt like to be different. And you know what happened?" The silence in the studio was absolute. "For the first time in my life, kids listened to me. Really listened. She had turned my biggest insecurity into my greatest strength in one morning." It's impossible not to feel how a person with vision can completely transform the narrative of another life. James discreetly wiped his own eyes. "That's incredible, but surely there's more." "Oh, there's so much more," Shaq said, a mixture of pain and gratitude coloring his voice. "She started staying after school with me every day. Not for basketball. Nobody even knew I could play basketball yet. She stayed to help me with reading." He looked directly at Mrs. Dorothy. "I was dyslexic, and nobody had ever been patient enough to help me understand that my brain just worked differently. She spent hours of her own time teaching me strategies to read better." Mrs. Dorothy finally found her voice, although it trembled with emotion. "Shaquille, you were so intelligent. You just needed someone to show you how to unlock it." "But the most important thing," Shaq said, his voice gaining strength, "was what she did when the other kids were still being cruel. Instead of just telling them to stop, she educated them." He turned completely to the audience, as if giving a lesson. "She brought in books about famous tall people throughout history. She showed them pictures of basketball players, yes, but also scientists, actors, leaders. She made them research and present reports about how different physical characteristics had been strengths throughout human history. What's most impressive is how a true educator doesn't just protect their students, they transform entire minds." "Within a month," Shaq continued, "instead of being the kid everyone made fun of, I became the kid everyone was curious about. She changed how an entire school saw difference." Mrs. Dorothy was crying openly now. "I just wanted you to see what I saw," she said softly. "And what did you see?" James asked gently. "I saw a gentle giant who was trying to make himself small in a world that needed him to be big," Mrs. Dorothy replied, her voice gaining the strength that only true teachers possess when speaking about their students. "I saw leadership, kindness, intelligence, and so much potential that it took my breath away." Shaq approached her again. "She didn't just change how others saw me. She changed how I saw myself. But the moment that really saved my life, the moment I'll never forget, was 3 months later." The tension in the air was palpable as everyone waited for the final revelation. I came to school one day feeling terrible. My biological father, Joe Tony, had reached out after years of absence and then disappeared again without explanation. I was angry, hurt, confused about who I was supposed to be as a man. Shaq's voice cracked slightly. I went to Mrs. Williams's classroom during lunch, ready to tell her I was done. Done with school, done with trying, done with believing I could be anything special. "And what did she do?" James asked, though his voice was barely above a whisper. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something that I carry with me every single day of my life. Shaq turned to face Mrs. Dorothy directly. She said, "Shaquille, your father's absence doesn't define your presence. Your size isn't meant to intimidate. It's meant to inspire. And someday, when you're successful and famous, you're going to use your platform to lift up other kids who feel like giants in a world made for smaller people." The audience was completely silent, many visibly crying. "She saw my future before I could even imagine it," Shaq said, his voice now strong and clear. "And then she made me a promise that changed everything." "What promise?" Mrs. Dorothy asked, genuinely curious, as if she had forgotten. Shaq smiled through his tears. "You promised me that if I graduated high school and went to college, you would be at my graduation. Both of them." Mrs. Dorothy's eyes widened as the memory came flooding back. "And you know what?" Shaq said, turning to address the entire studio. "She kept that promise. Mrs. Dorothy Williams drove from San Antonio to Baton Rouge to watch me graduate from LSU. She was there when I got my degree, 35 years later." The audience erupted in applause, but Shaq held up his hand. "But tonight, I have a promise to make to her." And at that moment, with all of America watching, Shaquille O'Neal was about to reveal something that would make even the toughest cry like children. Some promises are made with words, but the most powerful ones are made with actions that echo through entire generations. The silence in the Late Late Show studio was so deep that you could hear the soft hum of the cameras. Mrs. Dorothy Williams looked at Shaquille O'Neal with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, as if she sensed that her life was about to change forever. Can you sense that there are moments when the universe stops to witness an act of pure gratitude? "Mrs. Williams," Shaq said, his voice loaded with a solemnity that made the entire audience lean forward. 35 years ago, you made me a promise. Tonight, it's my turn to make you a promise." James Corden was visibly moved, knowing he was witnessing something historic. "Shaq, what kind of promise?" Shaq took a deep breath, like a man about to reveal the most important secret of his life. "Mrs. Williams, you told me that someday I would use my platform to lift up other kids who felt like giants in a world made for smaller people. You were right. But what you didn't know is that every single thing I've done in my career, every charity, every scholarship, every time I've helped a kid, I did it thinking about you." Mrs. Dorothy covered her mouth with her hands, tears flowing freely down her face. My foundation has helped over 50,000 kids go to college, Shaq continued. Every single scholarship has a little plaque that says, "In honor of educators who see potential where others see problems." That's you, Mrs. Williams. That's always been you. What's most impressive is how a seed of kindness planted by one person can grow and feed thousands of other lives. But tonight, Shaq said, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket, I want to do something specific for you. He knelt again before her, offering the paper with the reverence of someone offering a sacred treasure. What is this? Mrs. Dorothy asked, her hands trembling as she unfolded the document. It's the deed to a house, Shaq said simply. A house in San Antonio, fully paid, in your name. The audience exploded in applause, but Shaq raised his hand asking for silence. But that's not all. Mrs. Williams, I know you've been living on a teacher's pension for 15 years since you retired. I know it's been hard. So I've set up a fund that will give you $5,000 every month for the rest of your life. Mrs. Dorothy was sobbing now, unable to form words. James Corden had tears streaming down his face, and half the audience was crying openly. And there's one more thing, Shaq said, his voice breaking slightly. I know your granddaughter Sarah is starting college next year, and your grandson Michael wants to go to medical school. Their education is completely paid for. Full scholarships. Everything included. It's impossible not to feel when we witness gratitude transformed into concrete action that changes real lives. Mrs. Dorothy finally managed to speak, her voice being only an emotional whisper. Shaquille, why? I was just doing my job. I was just being a teacher. No, Shaq said firmly, taking her small hands between his enormous ones. You weren't just being a teacher. You were being an angel in disguise. You saved a broken 15-year-old kid who thought he was a monster, and you turned him into someone who could help others. He turned to the audience, his voice gaining the strength of someone carrying a mission. Ladies and gentlemen, this woman taught me the most important lesson of my life, that our differences aren't meant to divide us. They're meant to make us stronger together. She taught me that being big isn't about intimidating people. It's about having more space in your heart for compassion. The audience was standing now, applauding through tears. But most importantly, Shaq continued, she taught me that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear reading glasses and carry lesson plans. Sometimes they stay after school to help one awkward kid learn to read. Sometimes they drive 8 hours to watch that kid graduate from college. Mrs. Dorothy tried to stand, and Shaq helped her gently. When she stood up, she looked directly into his eyes and said something that made even the cameras seem to tremble with emotion. Shaquille O'Neal, she said, her voice now strong and clear. You were never broken. You were always exactly who you were supposed to be. I just helped you see it. And then happened the moment that no one in the studio would ever forget. Shaq enveloped Mrs. Dorothy in a hug that seemed to contain 35 years of gratitude, love, and recognition. She completely disappeared in his arms, but somehow, in that embrace, she seemed bigger than him. The audience didn't stop applauding. James Corden was crying openly. And on social media, the clip was already being shared millions of times, with hashtags like Teaching Heroes in Classrooms and Teachers Change the World. When they finally separated, Shaq turned to the cameras one last time. If you're watching this and you have a teacher who changed your life, don't wait 35 years like I did. Call them tomorrow. Visit them. Thank them. Because teachers like Mrs. Williams are the real champions of the world. He paused, letting the words settle like a blessing over everyone watching. Mrs. Williams, thank you for saving my life. But more than that, thank you for teaching me how to save others. 3 months later, Mrs. Dorothy Williams moved into her new house in San Antonio, a house with a garden where she now teaches neighborhood children to read on sunny Texas afternoons. Shaq visits regularly, always bringing books and always calling her my angel teacher. Sarah, her granddaughter, is studying medicine at the University of Texas with a full scholarship from the Shaq Foundation. Michael is preparing for Harvard Medical School, also with all expenses paid. And at the entrance to Mrs. Dorothy's new house, there's a plaque that Shaq had made. Home of Dorothy Williams, the teacher who proved that giants can be gentle, and gentle people can create giants. Because in the end, true greatness isn't measured in height, titles, or achievements. It's measured in the capacity to transform one life, which transforms another life, which transforms the entire world. And sometimes, that transformation begins with a brave teacher who sees a gentle giant where others see only a lost boy and decides to make a simple promise. I'm going to help you see that your size isn't a curse, it's a gift. A promise that echoed through decades and touched millions of lives. A promise that proved that true heroes use chalk, not capes.